Hi, my name is Ilana Horn. I'm a professor at Vanderbilt University, and I'm going to be talking today about carceral pedagogy and why it needs to end. I'll link it to anti-Blackness in U.S. society and particularly in U.S. schools, and press us to imagine alternative forms of education for Black students. Throughout the presentation, you'll see me pulling citations of Black scholars who have done deep work on this. So carcerality refers to the physical domination and confinement of bodies in institutional spaces, particularly when it reinstates and maintains white supremacy. Sociologist Carla Shedd has written a lot about carcerality in schools, and it's important to understand the nuance that saying that schools are carceral is not to say schools are prisons, but rather to recognize the way that these forms of domination and white supremacy exist on a spectrum that includes some schooling practices. Of particular concern to me are the schooling practices of no-excuse charters that tend to serve predominantly Black and brown communities. I see these approaches as often carceral. My journey on this began 5 years ago when I wrote on my blog a critique of Teach Like a Champion, a book authored by a man named Doug Lemov, who's associated with the Uncommon Schools, one of the No Excuses charters. What I noticed about these practices was their emphasis on controlling and dominating children's bodies over their joy and freedom and curiosity. It seemed like a distinctly undemocratic and unnurturing way of teaching. It's not surprising, though, when we look at the roots of how Lemov devised this system of teaching. He started with test scores. That was the main aim, was producing better test scores, and worked backwards to what kinds of teaching practices might produce those test scores. So the point is not students flourishing. The point is they're learning the rote things they need to produce good scores on tests. As he says, the classroom is not a democracy, it's a very enlightened dictatorship, which I find alarming to give teachers that kind of power over minoritized students. Lest you think I'm being dramatic, I want you to hear too from children and teachers who have worked at Success Academy or Uncommon schools. There's an Instagram account called Black at Uncommon that documents some of these experiences and defines them as carceral. For example, in this excerpt, the student says that their Uncommon's discipline system really mirrors the prison system, and goes on to say that the adults' fixation on uniforms and not our actual mental and emotional well-being is astounding and truly disturbing. The students and teachers at Black at Uncommon have put forth a list of demands of what they want to see change. It includes abolishing what they call the prison-like conditions of the discipline programs. So carcerality makes sense when you look in the broader context of the United States. We know, for example, that anti-Blackness is deeply rooted in our history. In fact, it's foundational. It was used to justify the violence of chattel slavery, and these anti-Black ideologies circulated for centuries in the US. The ideologies imputed the morality, intelligence, and worthiness of Black people in their lives. Just because laws change doesn't mean ideologies go away, and in fact they harm Black children in particular ways. As scholars have documented, Black children are very often adultified in schools, meaning that they're not viewed as children and given the grace and presumed innocence that children need as they learn to regulate themselves and be a part of the world. Instead, Black children are disproportionately disciplined in schools, having higher suspension rates than children from other backgrounds. When you look at the data about the nature of those offenses, they are often the kind that are left to adults' discretion. In other words, discipline is a part of a larger picture of anti-Blackness in schools that includes things like segregation, which we have a historical investment in, whether it's de jure or de facto, and I give some examples there, or whether it comes from the unequal resources that segregation allows to exist and flourish, where poor non-white school districts receive shockingly less funding than more affluent and more white school districts in this country. And a broader picture, too, of assimilationism, where Blackness is pathologized through the erasure of Black history in the curriculum and the contributions of Black Americans, whether it's the centering of white voices and authors and experiences in literacy curriculum, whether it's the linguistic racism of positioning African American vernacular English as unintelligent, whether it's the dress codes that penalize Black hairstyles or other cultural or self-presentation. All of this together constitutes a form of what scholars have called slow violence toward Black children in schools, which takes a toll over time. We need to imagine a different possibility at this time. We need to use this moment to try to imagine what schooling might look like if it centered Black liberation, if it cared about Black joy. So my call to action is to get rid of teaching and schooling approaches that are focused on control and domination, to root out anti-Black ideologies in schools, whether that's in curriculum or in linguistic practices or dress codes, to restore notions of Black childhood and allow children the grace that they need to develop and flourish, to foster Black children's brilliance and joy by celebrating the richness of their languages and cultures. And for goodness sake, let's encourage their laughter. School should be a place where they feel welcomed. If you want to look specifically at your own practice, there are some things you can reflect on to root out where you might have anti-Blackness in your own teaching. Notice the way that you invite or ignore Black students in your classroom activities. Notice how you read students and their potential. What assumptions do you make based on their hairstyle, language, or clothing? Where do you make space for your students' culture, language, and ideas to be a part of your classroom and the learning that goes on there? I hope that this has helped you think harder about how we can make sure that Black children's lives and learning flourish.